that's probably my greatest challenge right now in terms of the intuitiveness and the expert design and the theoretical foundations that that we need to use. I feel very comfortable with all that. It's probably the would an iPod really work here? Would this software really work? That's the piece.
I think we don't do ourselves any favors when we kind of think about technology and visual design and all that stuff before we're thinking about what do we want people to do with that. Because I'm not taking away from the importance of style and the importance of form, but I think in an educational environment, form really ought to follow function and not function ought to follow, well, I want to do something online or I want to do something like that.
I'm always cognizant or making myself aware and my students aware of that, What are you teaching here? Are you teaching them critical thinking skills, problem solving skills, or are you teaching them decision making skills, or are you teaching them how to understand a concept? What are you teaching them?
Figure out ways to help clients articulate what behaviors they want a participant in this experience to engage in, and thinking is a behavior.
Look at the problem really from all of the interrelated connections, everything that the bigger picture, obviously, the organizational issue, the community. I mean, I was, and assemble the right people, ask the right questions. That was critical. That was so critical. Ask the right questions.
Solve ahead of where you are. Solve problems ahead of where you are. Learning how to be a designer is a problem-solving exercise. You have to become aware of things that you didn't see before. A designer, by the way, all through their design life should be constantly going through that. As you design for a particular problem that you're a design problem that you've taken on, you have to solve a problem that will satisfy the client, but you also have to solve a little bit more. Always do just a little bit more than you're asked. And then you'll have this extra lesson that you learned, and you put it in your back pocket for your next project.
Negotiate up front that's what you want your students to learn, and manage the client's expectations. So don't just take the project and as is. Look at the project, look at what they want you to develop, look at your time limit, how many students you have, what you want the students to learn, and make sure you manage the client's expectations and the students' expectations. That's definitely, negotiate the scope of the project, I think, is extremely important.
Recognize your abilities and your inabilities, your limitations as a designer. Be honest with those limitations. Be honest with the client in terms of your recommendations, but have backup. I didn't come in with, I think you should. I came in with visuals and documented, a documented process that I think they needed to follow. So really, it has to be documented, and they have to be very clear. A designer has to be very clear on their recommendations, because the client doesn't know. They have their own decision in their mind.
Somebody said that to allow children to determine how they learn is the same as allowing a garden to decide whether it'll grow flowers or weeds. And I really think that's the case. I think that it's great to empower students. I want to do that. It's great to have students interact with each other. I want to do that. But to do that in an open-ended, non-directed, non-guided way is absolute folly. And I'm afraid that we're way too often going down the folly route. So my advice to designers, I think you need to study and learn and find those principles that are general and important and critical to learning. I think you need to study the process of learning.
It can be really exciting to solve very boring problems if you recognize what you're doing as a very special case of design. Some of the most creative people in the world work on the problems that sound like they're not going to be sexy. Because they find huge entertainment in, squeezing 350 words into a back front pamphlet and still make it readable to people over 60. If you're really a designer and you really have chosen this area to be a designer in, that's like going to Disneyland.